I want to get into some of the details about data collection, data reporting, and so you can see in a little more detail what's in the database. So I guess the best way to summarize this is this way: good data in always equals good data out. Right. So if we want good data in, we need to make sure that we're collecting the right data. And one thing that we've been very diligent about is we've avoided really asking institutions to do any significant manipulation of their data before they submit it. And I think you're going to see that. So the reason for that, I think, is fairly obvious. But the more manipulation you're doing, the more likely it is that different institutions are interpreting different or data different ways. So you end up with, while institutions may be the same, they may have made different decisions about what goes in each bucket. So we've really tried to follow data that you're already reporting and other sources, so that you're not looking at making those decisions about where to put information. So we think we get better comparability that way. So while I'm mentioning data sources, let me talk about where the data is. And so I want to make sure to make this comment before I do that. I know what everybody's thinking. I don't need another survey to fill out, right? We all get these email requests, participate in this survey or that survey, and clearly we don't have enough staff to respond to everything. We just don't have the time to deal with one more data request. And the folks who've been working on this for the last 6 years, obviously we are faced with the same questions, and so are very mindful of that challenge. So we've tried to make sure that we keep that in mind in the types of data that we ask institutions to report. So we've simplified, or we try to keep it very simple, the sources of data that are necessary to participate. And there are really only three sources where your information is going to come from. It should all be readily available, so it's easy to take them from existing sources for your institution and then put them into the database, and participation should be relatively easy. And for most institutions, it's once you've gone through it the first time, the first year might take a little bit longer, but after that, typically it's an hour or less to gather and report the data. So really fairly simple. So university financial statements, college or university financial statements, is really the primary source of data. So most of the information is going to be taken directly off of your financial statements and plugged into the data collection screens in the platform. And because we use annual financial statements, that we typically follow that reporting cycle. So, most of us have our financials prepared and ready by November or December. So we open data collection in early November, and we close it at the end of February, because that tends to fall around the annual financial statement reporting cycle for most of us. So, while you're wrapping up those financial statements and you have them handy, just keep those pages out, go over and fill out the data reporting worksheet for the platform, and then you've got most of what you need right there. The second source is employment data by functional area. And this is the one area that may take a little bit of data manipulation on the part of the institution. We report, as you saw from some of my examples, we report revenue and expenses by FTE employee in most cases, and in other cases we report it by FTE student. So we do need to get employee counts by function to be able to do that. So many of us, particularly smaller institutions, we don't necessarily track employee FTEs by functional area, although it is really important information. As you could see even from some of the examples I've already given you, we just, in a lot of cases, we just don't have that built into our accounting systems to be able to divide out an FTE by function. So, for most employees, this is pretty simple. Teaching faculty member obviously is one FTE in instruction. An accountant in the business services office is one FTE in institutional support. So, those are pretty simple. You know which bucket to put them in. It gets a little more complicated when we have allocated employees. So a teaching faculty member who has half-time release for research obviously has to be split up in some way. So, it may be that you need to create some allocations if you're not doing this already. Some institutions already have their FTE employees allocated out by function. Others would need to create it. But really, once it's done the first time, it's really fairly simple to follow that up year after year with the same allocations. So it might take a little bit more time the first year, as I've said, but shouldn't be a time-consuming process after that. And then the last source of data is around student enrollment and student success. So there's 4 enrollment-related data points: undergraduate FTE, graduate FTE, freshman retention, undergraduate graduation rate. All 4 of those should be pretty readily available. Those are standard data points that we all report in one source or another. So iPads or many others require us to report those same data points. So those should be readily available as well. So we've created a data collection worksheet that should be helpful in collecting this data. The worksheet is really voluntary. We just created it as a helpful means to gather all the data before you start entering it. The collection worksheet, as you're going to see, is organized around 4 areas: institutional profile data, revenue and some asset data, expenses by function, and then expenses in total. And so those 4 areas align with the 4 areas where you're going to be responding to questions within the platform. So we've organized them the same way. So this is the first of the 4 sections. This is institutional details, and these are all important because these are ways that you then can go back and compare yourselves to peers. So these are all important distinctions among our institutions, different ways that we look at ourselves. So public versus private, category of research, comprehensive small community college, et cetera. So all different ways to look at ourselves in all ways that once we've collected that data, that you can slice the data into peer groups that you can identify institutions that look most like what you want to compare to. So these are all data points that then can be used for comparison purposes. And then there's some high-level financial data. Again, all of this directly relates to your financial statement, so you should be able to go directly to the balance sheet, income statement, pull these off. So it should be readily available. This is where the bulk of the data is, and so really this is probably 70 to 75% of the data points are right here on this worksheet. It's as you can see, the rows are by function. The columns are for employees, total cost of the function, compensation for that function, and then other for that function. Now there's 2 other columns at the end: operation, maintenance, and plant, and depreciation. Those fields are important because obviously there are both public and private institutions that are part of the benchmarking database, and we have different accounting standards that we follow. So there are some differences in the way we report expenses. So there are some fields that private institutions use that publics don't, and vice versa. So here, these last 2 columns, operation, maintenance, and plant, and depreciation, those are strictly for privates, so that we can then, in the data reporting, we can make sure that we're comparing like data across institutions. So, if you want to compare both publics and privates in your peer list, you can do that safely because we've accounted for the differences in the accounting by the way we collect this. And then the last section is really just, these are check digits, right? So if we're asking for employees across functions, then we also ask for the total employees, including all functions, so that we can check it, make sure you entered everything correctly. Same thing for total costs in each of these areas. So these are really more as a way to check yourself as anything else.